Shalom, everybody. This is Rabbi Stuart Darrowman from Interfaithfulness, where we're building bridges, where history builds walls. And one of the things we're building bridges to at this time in our development is building bridges to household spirituality, because we believe that's very important. It's part of a project that we call CHAI, the Chavurot Action Initiative. And my partner in the Chavurot Action Initiative is Dr. Bruce Stokes. And so let's bring him in today. Hello, Dr. Stokes.
Hi, Stuart. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine. And I thought maybe before we get into anything, we'd introduce ourselves a little bit to people so they know a little about us, although after all the years of experience we have, we could spend 2 hours talking. But let's just concentrate on our educational niche. What's your educational niche, Dr. Stokes?
My undergraduate was a combination of psychology, sociology, and anthropology. And then I did a master's and PhD in anthropology. Specifically, I'm interested in psychological anthropology. That's the relationship between the mind and cognition and culture. And so very interested in identity, sexuality, marriage and family, anything that relates to those intersections.
And you've been teaching about the intersection of theology and behavioral sciences for well over 30 years at California Baptist University. Is that so?
Yeah, we actually teach what we call Christian behavioral science, but technically what it is using theology as a behavioral science. So we ask the same thing psych, soc, and anthro asks, but instead of using theory from the behavioral sciences, we answer that from Jewish and Christian theology.
Right. And your dissertation is very interesting to me, which is one of the reasons why we're partners. What was your dissertation on when you did your PhD?
My dissertation was on the Messianic Jewish movement as a revitalization movement, an identity revitalization movement of first century Jewish identity as followers of Yeshua. So how are those connected? That's what it was about.
That's great. And my dissertation was on the rabbi as a surrogate priest. My dissertation and my master's degree and PhD were in intercultural studies, also known as missiology, which is a cross-disciplinary area where we study everything that has to do with culture and religious truth and how these are transmitted and how they are best embodied in different cultures. And my dissertation was showing how the role of the rabbi has developed in history as an appropriation of the roles of priests and Levites back in Scripture. So I show the Messianic movement that a rabbi is a rabbi and not necessarily just a pastor with switched labels. He has certain functions which are traceable to the priests and Levites. And again, that was called the rabbi as a surrogate priest. So we're working together on this Chai project, and this conversation we're having today is what we call a table talk, where we discuss various hot issues. And today we want to discuss the issue of kinship and covenant. What, particularly from the vantage point of the Bible, who or what are we meant to be to each other? That's a question which is not often articulated, but we're going to look at it today. So let's. Do you have it up on the screen now?
No, I think
Bruce?
it just dropped down. You had it up there a minute ago.
Okay, let's try it again. Thank you. Here we go. There we are. And we'll start from the beginning here and look at all these issues. Chavurot, kinship, and covenant. Categories of kinship in Abraham's world. There's just a few verses here in Genesis chapter 14 that are packed with at least 4 different kinship categories. That may not sound exciting, to those who are listening to us, but as they tune in, they're going to realize it's very illuminating. Here's what we read. This takes place after Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, was captured as a prisoner of war, together with the people of Sodom and of other cities of the valley. We read this. But as they left, they took Lot, Avram's brother's son, and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. Someone who had escaped came and told Avram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, all of them allies of Avram. When Avram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led out his trained men who had been born in his house, 318 of them, and they went and pursued as far as Dan. So let's look here and unpack this. In these few verses, we find a number of categories of how we are related to each other, or how we ought to relate to each other. This first one is called consanguineal kinship, of the same blood. We read, but as they left, they took Lot, Avram's brother's son. So they're of one blood together, and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. So this is the first category we see here. Anything for you to say to this as an anthropologist, Bruce?
Well, this is biological kinship, and it's usually traced through either the father's line patrilineally or the mother's line matrilineally. Occasionally it can be traced like we do through both of them, but they're very important historically for people groups.
You know, in the Jewish world, it's a very controversial thing. In the Orthodox world at this time, the assumption is that Jewish identity is through the mother's line. It's matrilineal. But the Reform Jews and Reconstructionist Jews and increasingly conservative Jews are saying that no, it can be also patrilineal. And the Orthodox world is very upset because they're saying, well, then your children will not really be Jews to us because we are matrilineal and you're being both matrilineal and patrilineal. So it can be a hot issue.
Yes.
But here's another category that appears in this text. Someone who had escaped came and told Avram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, the Amori, the Amorite. Those two terms, Hebrew and Amorite. The Amorites is a term for everybody who was living in that broad area of the Middle East. They were all called Amorites. That was not a national identity. It was a much broader identity than that. And the term Hebrew, well, that's interesting. Avram right now is the only Hebrew, and you might count Sarah too, but there's no Isaac yet. There's no Abraham, no Isaac, no Jacob, no 12 tribes. But Avram is being called the Hebrew here, which could mean that he's just part of a group of people that are passing through. It's kind of a term for people who are crossing over. But I know you have another perspective on why it might say Avram the Hebrew. What is that?
Yeah, I think as Moses is writing this, we get two little indications that he might be explaining Avram as, in a sense, the Hebrew, that ethnic term, because he says they pursued as far as Dan. Well, Dan as an area didn't exist at that time either. So the Torah being written, filling in notions so that people can keep aware of who's being talked about and what's coming.
So Moses, who's writing the 5 books of Moses, is looking at Avram retrospectively, and he's using some labels that were later developed to refer to what Avram stood for. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, what we would call ethnicity.
Sure. So that's another kind of kinship then. We have blood kinship, consanguineal, and then we have ethnic kinship that people share. And with each of these areas, there are certain inherent responsibilities. There are things one expects of people who are of the same blood, and there may be a certain bond that one expects of people who share your ethnicity. But let's go on to another category that we find in this text. Someone who had escaped came and told Avram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner. All of them were allies of Avram. That's another kind of kinship. The term is Ba'alei Brit. They're partners in a covenant. Can you think of any kinds of alliances that we share nowadays that are kind of parallel to this, Dr. Stokes?
Well, I think a lot of people have informal, some have formal treaties. I don't think this was a formal treaty. This is more of people who have agreed that they are going to be a mutual aid community with each other, and they will help each other out in terms of their needs. They'll use mutual protection, that kind of thing. And so this word ally is used for that kind of informal grouping of people who have mutual aid goals in mind.
Sure. In this case, it's I'll watch your back, you'll watch mine.
Yep.
If somebody attacks you, I'll look out for you. If somebody attacks me, you look out for me.
Exactly.
So that's another kind of alliance, another kind of kinship. Then we have something that doesn't appear in this passage, a phenol. That's relationships by law, but not by blood. What kind of relationships would those be, Dr. Stokes?
Well, these are relationships certainly of marriage, and we talk about people who are our in-laws. I mean,
Yes.
Technically, my wife is an in-law to me, but I don't call her that, right? So, but all of her relatives become my relatives when I married her. And so we have those, but we also have adoptions and other legal kinds of relationships that render obligations and rights in different contexts.
Right. These are relationships by law. That's very interesting. Phenol relationships. And finally, we find this one, fictive relationships, people who are like family to each other. When Avram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led out his trained men who had been born in his house, 318 of them, born in his house. They weren't his children. He didn't have any children yet. But they're part of his household.
Right.
They're part of his posse, his entourage. They're like family to him. Anything you want to say about fictive relationships?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that Americans don't always understand this kind of thing.
No.
This is not just a pretend friend. This is a person who acts in the role of a mother or a brother or a father or a daughter or a cousin. And so you really have a sense of that. It's what the Bible's talking about when it says there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. There are people that you can depend on more than you can sometimes your blood relatives or your legal relatives. These are people who really fit into that role. Everybody's got an Uncle Charlie or an Aunt Mildred who's really, they can't figure out where the relationship is, but they're a real good friend of one of the family members, and they become part of the family.
I was touching on this in teaching the other night, and I see that people sometimes get a kind of a worried look on their face because in our culture is highly individualistic, and people don't want obligation or responsibility for each other, and they may not even want other people too close to their lives. Do you think that causes spiritual problems, Doctor?
Well, I do think it does. You know, the American culture has always been seen as a rugged individual culture, but we're really moving into radical individualism. And what that does is it translates into alone, or it can translate into narcissism. So it's not a good thing. We're created to be relational, communal, social beings, and it's very difficult to make a way all by yourself.
There's a woman named Sherry Turkle who teaches at MIT on the interfacing of psychology and technology. And she's written a number of books. Most recently, one of them is called Alone Together. And she shows how through the internet, we're networked more than ever, but we're not really connected with each other.
Yeah, a
We
lot
are
of people's relationships are really utilitarian. They're not real relationships in
no,
that sense.
and we suffer from that
Yeah,
eventually. But that's not what was intended in the scripture. The scripture talks about kinship and covenant. A covenantal relationship is a relationship which entails explicit or implicit mutual responsibilities of some sort. These kind of kinships that we've been talking about imply covenantal relationship. There are things that we can depend upon and things that people have a right to depend upon from us. And what this means for us is, how did the early Yeshua believers see themselves as being related to each other? What kind of kinship and covenant relationship did they share? Were they rugged individualists who didn't want anybody to get too close? No, I don't think so.
no.
There's a great quote here from Joseph Hellerman, who says that in the early Yeshua communities, God was the father of the community. Believers were brothers and sisters. And by the way, Yeshua was the eldest brother.
Right.
And the group came first over the aspirations and desires of the individual. That's interesting. Family values, ranging from intense emotional attachment to the sharing of material goods and to uncompromising family loyalty, determined the relational ethos of believer behavior. Family values of the group trumping individual uh, autonomy, and God being the father of the community, believers being brothers and sisters. So, are you saying, Dr. Stokes, that when Paul tells us to refer to one another as brother and sister and father and mother, that he's not just using a kind of a handy metaphor to say, let's all be friends?
Yeah, this is not a slogan. The idea, he tells Timothy to treat the older men as fathers with respect, the older women as mothers, the younger women as sisters with due respect, and the men. Everyone is immediate family in the household of God. And so we're to treat each other the way those roles are intended to be. Now, not the way we do often in our dysfunctional families, but to do that in a godly manner, because it's not a game. It brings into our mind the psychological reality that we belong to one another. We don't just belong to God, we belong to one another.
You know, I've just been thinking that people come to me for counsel and for advice, for mentoring, and uh, and regularly I'll encounter people who feel isolated and lonely. Sometimes, often they come from families that that were very unhealthy,
Mhm.
families that rejected them or neglected them or mistreated them. And would you say that these kinds of communities, such as we're describing, are a healing modality for such people?
There's supposed to be a healing modality. If you can give somebody a new understanding of what this relationship is, not the one that hurt, but one that really is healing, and one that is encouraging, and one that stays faithful and can be trusted, it brings a lot of healing. We need a lot less therapy and a whole lot less medications if we followed these guidelines.
Yes, I would tend to agree. So the question then is, how might all this productively impact future community formation? Because we each inhabit one or more of these kinship categories, especially in our fellowships. We have this fictive relationship. Our communities and individuals will mature, as you said, as we enrich and explore our kinship relationship with each other, our familial fictive relationship. So we need places where that happens. You know, I was just reading last night in Hebrews, teaching in Hebrews, says, that we should look out for each other and to forsake not the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is. Uh, we're, we're supposed to have the kinds of fellowships where we can be intimately related to each other. We should see ourselves as family together within the Father's hand in these Chavurot. familial gatherings where people meet together, eat together, pray together, and learn together to grow together, serving Tikkun Olam. Anything else you want to say about this kind of connection to the Chavurah?
Well, I believe that if people will begin to practice these things and really learn the relational skills needed for the reciprocal relationships, they'll begin to have a sense of belonging and a sense of unity of the spirit in the bond of love that the scripture tells us to have.
Yes, it's very helpful. So everybody watching this, I just want you to remember that Bruce and I are involved in something called CHAI, the Chavurah Action Initiative. You can write to us at chai@interfaithfulness.org. You can even subscribe to our Shabbat home discussion guide, which is called Shulchan Shalanu. Comes out every week on Thursday night. It comes to you as a PDF, and it's good for discussing the things of God with your family and friends around your table on the weekend. You can find out more about that at www.interfaithfulness.org Shulchan. Well, we've covered a lot of territory today, Dr. Bruce. So I just think we ought to say bye-bye to our friends right now. Thank you for your time, and we'll find something to talk about next time.
All right.
So thanks, everybody. This is Stuart Dowd from Interfaithfulness, where we're building bridges, where history builds walls. Shalom for now.